Hello and welcome to another episode of the Project Purple podcast. I'm Dino Verli, founder and CEO, and today we are back in the podcast studio. Been doing this for over 4 years now. We're up to, I think, over 77,000 downloads of the Project Purple podcast. That is an amazing accomplishment. So thank you guys for tuning in every week and listening to all the great guests that we have. And today's a special episode. I say that all the time, that we always have special guests and special episodes, but I truly believe that. But we've got a panel for us here today with some of our former guests. And first, I'd like to make the introductions. I'm going to introduce Cynthia Hayes, who's been on our podcast a couple times. Welcome back, Cynthia, the author of The Big Ordeal, Understanding and Managing the Psychological Turmoil of Cancer. We've got pancreatic cancer survivor Michele Miller. Welcome back, Michele. And pancreatic cancer survivor John Walmsley. Welcome back. And before we get into it, this is like a New York East Coast podcast because Cynthia, you're in New York, I'm in Connecticut. I got two other fellow New Englanders all the way up from Maine and Rhode Island. We could be like a music band possibly put together.
There you go.
And John, I know you play music, so
I'm in.
You're in. John will lead us through that quartet here. So welcome everyone to the Project Purple podcast once again.
Thank you, Dino.
Good. Thank you,
to be
Dino.
here with you.
And for our audience, this has been a long time coming. I know Michele and John have been awesome with us here to come back on the podcast. But Cynthia, you and I have talked about this episode for quite some time. I think summer and travels and just, kind of scheduling, getting everyone's schedule in order has taken us a little bit longer than I wanted to, quite honestly. And I'm sure for you. But, when we had you on the podcast last, we talked about, bringing survivors back on for a panel to talk about kind of these really high level subjects about what your book has talked about and what you've been doing in the community. I mean, you've been a guest on the podcast, but I follow you on social media. I know you're out and about every day talking about this hard subject of how people deal with cancer and how to get through that cancer journey. And not just, I know we focus a lot here on pancreatic cancer, but this is about all cancers. So I thank you for your patience, first of all. But this is going to be a great episode because, as I said before we hit record, we've been on this journey with the podcast for a long, long time, and I love doing these episodes. I love doing all the episodes because we're sharing knowledge, we're providing information. Hopefully, that for some people is the first time that they've heard about certain things that go through the cancer journey, and a lot of it's been with pancreatic cancer, but that's the power of this podcast is sharing that information and raising awareness. So the more and more we do it, the more we bring guests back on to talk about that and talk about these certain subjects. I get so excited about it. And clearly I've had too much caffeine this morning. So let's get into it here. So our first kind of high level discussion or question that we're going to tackle here is the overview of why cancer is so emotional and what to expect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand it off to Cynthia, and then we're going to go to our guests here on the panel. So with that, Cynthia, the mic is yours.
Well, thank you, Dino. And of course, this is a subject near and dear to my heart, not only because of my own cancer experience, but because of the work that I do now in mentoring cancer patients through the tough parts of diagnosis and treatment. As I have spoken about in the past, my own experience with cancer was not pancreatic, but endometrial. I had a diagnosis that came totally out of the blue. I flunked my pap smear, something I didn't know one could do, but I got a random call a week after a gynecologic visit. And when the cell phone showed that it was my gynecologist's office calling, I assumed someone was calling with a billing issue and picked up nonchalantly as I continued on my errands. And I sort of stopped dead in my tracks when the doctor actually said, Cynthia, there's some blah, blah, blah cells here on your pap smear, and I don't like it, and I need you back in here immediately for follow-up testing. I at the moment was on a mission, and she hung up quickly because she was delivering a baby, and I proceeded on my mission. And moments later, I stopped and I Googled the cells that she said that were detected on my pap smear. And it was like, holy crap, I'm going to die of cancer. And it was just hit me in an instant that that was a death sentence. And it was only much, much later that I came to understand that that was a common response. And that so many of us, when we hear the words, you've got cancer, assume we're going to die, go through that instant panic, and are dealing with fear and stress and anxiety so much throughout our cancer experiences. And of course, I didn't die. I ended up having a radical hysterectomy and 6 months of chemotherapy, and have now been free of disease for almost 7 years. But the process of finding out about the cancer and going through cancer and having all of that treatment led me down a path of inquiry that helped me understand not only that my response was pretty common, but that in fact, there is a somewhat predictable sequence of emotional responses that happen for almost everyone when they hear the words, you've got cancer. And a lot of that emotional experience is driven by changes at the cellular level, chemical changes in our bodies that get translated in the brain as emotional responses. After interviews with hundreds of cancer patients and loving caregivers and a variety of experts, including neuroscientists, I came to understand that it is those chemical changes that drive so much of the experience. And a big chemical change being the inflammatory process. I was not a biology major. I am not a doctor. I didn't know a lot of this beforehand, but I've come to understand that there's a class of proteins in our body called cytokines. And you may have heard of them recently because cytokine storms are part of the COVID response. But cytokines are proteins that allow the immune system to communicate with itself and tell the body what to do to help us heal. And there are pro-inflammatory cytokines and anti-inflammatory cytokines. And when you get a paper cut, the pro-inflammatory cytokines are released to the site of that paper cut. And they say, oh, we need some platelets here to close up this wound. Better send some white blood cells because there might be an infection. Oh, produce some more red blood cells because we just lost some out that paper cut. So this whole conversation starts going on in our bodies. And then when the paper cut begins to heal, the anti-inflammatory cytokines are released, and they say, okay, pull those extra white blood cells away, let them recover. We don't need any more red blood cells. Everything is calm. And the finger heals, and that's all fine. But if that's what's going on when you get a paper cut, imagine what happens when you have massive surgery for cancer. And it turns out that chemotherapy causes an increase in inflammatory cytokines, as does radiation treatment, as do many immunotherapies, and even the presence of cancer cells in our body and the presence of dying cancer cells in our body causes this inflammatory response. And that inflammatory response gets registered in the brain as, oh, we are too sick to deal with life. Let's hide in the cave. Let's pull the covers up over our heads. Let's dive underneath the surface, because if we put ourselves out there, some lion is going to come chasing us across the prairie, and that's going to be the end of us. So our bodies read that sickness behavior as everything that tells us go back to bed. And that encourages a lot of the emotional response that we feel, the fatigue, the fear and anxiety, the depression, the cognitive fuzziness that many of us experience. Add to that the fact that often our treatment includes steroids or opioids, which again change brain chemistry, or the surgery or chemotherapy influences the way our hormone producing organs behave. And we have more changes. So all of this is going on in our brains But nobody talks about it. And so we don't know as cancer patients that depression that we're feeling on day 3 or 4 after a chemo treatment is really the steroids that jacked us up 3 or 4 days ago, leaving our system, and now we feel low. We don't understand that it's perfectly normal to have that sense of fatigue and a mental confusion that comes with too many cytokines in our system. And so we think that we're being weak and not trying hard enough to get well, that we're not being positive enough in the experience. And so I've been talking to people about the emotional experience of cancer to try and help raise awareness of the fact that this is going on, whether we talk about it or not. It's not you. It's not a weakness. It's cancer. It's what happens with cancer. And just like a broken leg hurts, and you say to the doctor, gee, I got a lot of pain in addition to, needing to wear this cast. I'm really uncomfortable. We need to say to our medical care team, to our loving caregiving team, hey, I'm in emotional pain here. There's a lot of stuff going on. And let's talk about that so that I get the support that I need. And there are so many great support organizations out there. But if we don't know that it's okay to ask for that help, we don't ask for it, and therefore we don't get it.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here. And then I want to go to our guest here. Do you think the system, and we live in a great country, first of all, I'm not trying to badmouth anything here, but do you think the way that the system is created, and I often see this as like there's systematic issues in the system that don't allow for that to happen. So patients have to become their own advocate, because it's kind of like, if you don't ask, you don't get, right? Like, it's there, but again, as I go back, and not to this is not a commercial, but like, hopefully the information we should hear, because like no one knows unless they go through it, right? Like, you don't know what you don't know, right? And unless you go through it, and unless you ask the right questions, which most people don't know what to ask because they've never been through it, right?
Yeah, that's exactly
so
right.
The question then is that potentially this is like a systematic issue, or a systemic issue, I should say, within the medical field, that unfortunately, I think when we hear the word cancer, and this is coming from a non-cancer survivor, so take that what it is. When people hear cancer, they maybe the medical system is like, okay, how do we cure this? What are the steps to eliminate and move forward, and not worry about the exterior, like what all this other stuff? As to your point, Cynthia, your body goes through this storm, and you have this range of emotions that hit you, and that's just you. That's not your family, right? There's the support system, the external piece outside that we're not even mentioning here, right? But you as the person going through the cancer, and I think the medical system is designed to cure the cancer, cure the person, and not worry about anything else. So what I'd like to do here is I'd love to get some feedback from our panels here, and talk about, the why the cancer is so emotional, and maybe some of the things that our guests can share with what they encountered, and how they managed that portion of the emotional piece of cancer. So we'll go to Michele first.
Sure. Happy to start. And thanks for that, Dino. And Cynthia, I think I can relate a lot to what you were explaining about the physiological drivers of how I was feeling. I wasn't necessarily in the moment feeling those emotions, connecting it with the physiological part of it. And I think my experience, I've had wonderful healthcare throughout the course of my treatment. But I also knew whenever I went into the doctor's office for my next chemo session, or in preparation for the surgeries or whatnot, when I was asked, how are you feeling? It wasn't, I knew I wasn't to answer with, like mentally, how are you doing? It was, they wanted to run through what types of physical side effects are you having, so they could make adjustments in the medications and things of that nature. But I think I knew on some level that if I needed to have support for my emotional and kind of spiritual self, that I had to build that system for myself. And early on, when I was first diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, I did jump into a Facebook group, and I found someone there who reached out to me after I had put up a post. And that's how I found this podcast, because she had been a guest on the podcast, and she was being very generous to reach out to me to provide support. But I had this little healthy skepticism of interacting with people on the internet, and I wanted to make sure I knew what she was all about before I made that connection. And so I listened to her session here on the podcast. But that was kind of the starting of me recognizing that I needed to build a support system for myself that was separate from my medical providers, to help me to understand what I'm going through, what I'm going to feel mentally, and like, how do you manage some of the feelings about how this impacts in my case, my spouse or my children, or handling, working and not working, and those types of things. So I did, I guess I would go in saying I didn't have expectations that I would get that type of support from my medical providers, but I did understand that that's something that I needed to have as part of my team as I went through my treatments. And I sought out, whether it was virtually through other pancreatic cancer patients / survivors. I did seek out a counselor. So I went through some counseling. I felt like I needed someone for me, and I didn't want to continue to, your caregivers carry a big, big burden. And at some point I felt like I needed to have a place to put some of my heavy stuff without continuing to put it on my husband. And so that was a good outlet for me, in having a therapist that was just there for me. And then, like I said, kind of a grouping of people and forums that I could participate in and interact with, and find people like me to help support my emotional journey through having cancer and cancer treatment.
Yeah, you raised such a good point. I think that so often the medical doctor, the oncologists are so focused on the physical, and they're also not necessarily trained in the emotional or comfortable in dealing with the emotional. And so it is a don't ask, don't tell situation, where, they're going to inquire, well, how are you dealing with things in here and in here? They're just going to say, okay, physically, how are you feeling? And yet, incredible resources exist. In most hospitals, there are social services, there are support groups, there are complementary therapies, there are pain management programs. But because we're not aware of the fact that cancer causes these side effects, these emotional and psychological side effects, we don't know that we can ask for them. And the doctors don't want to raise the topic because, boy, you open up that can of worms and there goes your schedule for the day. So we're not going to get to see all the patients we need to see if we ask each one of them about their emotions. And so it is, as Dino said, somewhat of a systemic problem in the way we've structured our healthcare. But it's also the way, as a society, we think about ourselves. We don't think about ourselves as integrated, spiritual, emotional, cognitive, physical beings. We have different lives. We keep our cognitive self for our work. We keep our physical self for our exercise. We keep our emotional self to ourselves. And so there's and our spiritual self is assigned a special day or a special place. And so because we're not integrated, we're not experiencing cancer as an integrated experience either. And that's where a lot of the problems come for many of us. incredible the progress that has been made in cancer treatment and in resolving the physical effects of cancer. But we have a long ways to go when it comes to focusing on and understanding and dealing with the emotional side effects, both as a patient and, of course, as the loving caregivers, because they do go through a lot.
John, I want to slide over to you here and talk to you a little bit about this subject. And I know when I just looked at our notes here, when we spoke on our podcast, you had talked a little bit about this and how you dealt with that. So with that, the mic is yours on emotional experience and what you did and what to expect from cancer.
Thank you, Dino. And it's a pleasure to be here. You always do such a good job. Cynthia and Michele, you have certainly set the bar quite high for me. Great job. I was trying to do an analogy to a lot of the things that Cynthia was saying. And if you liken it to playing golf and a young child learning to play golf at a young age, there's so many different aspects of the game. And I'm not a golfer. I hit the ball, but I'm not a golfer. But so many people from a young age, they're trained and they learn the different aspects of the game, the woods, the irons, the putting, the grip, the ball placement, all of these things. And they study it. And by the time they become adults, and by the time let's say they get onto the pro tour, and you look at them and you say, how are they doing this? Well, they've trained their whole lives. For us, when we're diagnosed with any kind of cancer, when you're diagnosed with cancer, bang, you are whacked with it. Now, what are you going to do? You haven't been training for this your whole life. And like you were saying, Cynthia, the emotional side of it, well, it's all coming at the same time. And you're trying to deal with everything that's happening. Now, the clinical, the biological stuff that's happening to you inside with the diagnosis, with the treatment, with the operation and all of that, the chemo, the fatigue, you can understand it if you study it. But as a person who's just been whacked with it, it's tough. And it's so tough, like you were all saying about your wife or your spouse or your caregivers, your friends, your family. It's so difficult to deal with. And we're all different. We're all humans. We're just human beings. And we're all different. Our brains are different. Our bodies are different. Our activity levels are different. Everything is different. So every case is going to be different. But for me, the commonality, the thing that we all need to somehow get the strength to do is be positive. You have to learn as much as you can. And these podcasts I'm heavily involved with PanCan, the Pancreatic Cancer Action Network, and Dino's Project Purple. All of these things are getting the word out. And the more we know, the more we hear, the more we can somewhat understand it, the better off we're going to be able to handle it. And that's just, my 2 cents here at this point.
And you're so right. When we hear those words, I mean, first of all, there's almost universal shock and disbelief when we hear those words, no matter, what might have been going on in the body leading up to the diagnosis. When you hear you've got cancer, almost universal shock and disbelief. How can it be? How can it be me?
Yeah.
But we do almost all have to switch into this hyperactivity mode where we have to absorb so much information in order to come to a decision about, well, how are we going to proceed? And that's also almost a universal experience of both, hyper efficiency mode where we're taking in so much, but also sort of the overwhelming sense of information overload. And it's interesting. I mean, that's where I think one of the first examples of a chemical driven response occurs when we hear the words, "You've got cancer," because of the assumption that we're going to die. We get this massive adrenaline rush. And that adrenaline rush is supposed to help us prepare for the fight or flight syndrome. That adrenaline rush, though, has the unfortunate side effect of shutting down the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is thinking and rational and taking in information. And that means that we hear those words, "You've got cancer," and then probably don't hear anything else the doctor has to say, and we have to be able to reverse that chemical change in order to get through the next stage of actually hearing all of the information, making a decision about our care, rationalizing, okay, this choice makes more sense versus that choice, and figuring out how to move forward. And, right there, we're battling our chemistry in order to do that. I think you highlighted that so well, John. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cynthia, I got something that I wrote down, and I always take notes. I've mentioned that on many podcasts, on all the podcasts, but I wrote something down, and then you just said something, and I put something underneath this. And first of all, thank you, John and Michele, for sharing your thoughts on this. And I kind of, listening, kind of heard this, what I wrote down. You didn't come out and say it, but I guess I inferred it, and maybe that was me psychologically doing it as well. So I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but this we've talked about this, and it's acceptance, right? Acceptance of, like, this is the reality that you are fighting cancer. And my question to Cynthia here is, as we talk about why cancer is so emotional and what to expect, that a big piece of this is that acceptance.
I think that acceptance does eventually happen, but many of us fight that.
Correct.
And the acceptance, I guess, like when we start treatment, we want to be in control. As human beings, we like to be in control of our lives, of our existence. And yet when we start treatment, all of a sudden, we're not in control. We're not in control of our schedules. We're not in control of our physical response. We're not in control of our emotional response. And the idea that life is just totally beyond our ability to control is really, really challenging for many people. And I think we have to get past that phase of trying to control the uncontrollable in order to get to the point of accepting, okay, this is the reality of my life. And I think that acceptance sort of comes and goes in waves throughout the experience, that we can accept that, okay, now I have to have this surgery. We have the surgery, and then, oh, you have to have additional treatment. Okay, it's going to take me a little bit more time to understand what that additional treatment might be and to accept that that's what I have to do. And then we have the hope that that treatment works. And sometimes it works. And, we hear those glorious words, NED, no evidence of disease. And, we go dancing out of the office and we're fine. Sometimes what we hear is, no, we need to do maintenance treatment, or we need to do a secondary type of treatment or whatever. And so there's this constant need to embrace and accept, which means that we are constantly giving up a little bit more control in our lives. And I think that that's a battle that we all struggle with. And, we don't want to be complacent in our lives. And yet there is a need to accept the treatment and the reality that this is what life means. The chemotherapy protocol that I was on meant that I was going to be bald. And that happened within 4 weeks of when I started treatment. That required that I accept a new visual reality of myself. And I got a wig and, okay, I can deal with this. But then, 3 or 4 cycles into the chemotherapy, it wasn't just that I was bald, but I had no eyebrows. I had no eyelashes. I had no nasal hair. My allergies were just driving me crazy. And it wasn't that I could put a wig on and disguise the fact that I was a cancer patient. So there was another round of acceptance that I had to go through. And of course, that's a relatively, quote unquote minor thing, the visual reality of yourself, but it also is a reflection of what's going on inside and what's happening to your body. And that's the harder thing to accept, that my body has betrayed me, that I don't know if I will ever again be as healthy as I was, before the diagnosis. I don't know if the cancer is going to come back. And of course, that anxiety stays with us for a long time. People often talk about scanxiety, that they can sort of put aside the fear of recurrence or the fear of progression for weeks at a time. And then it's time for another scan to measure the effectiveness of treatment, or another test to see whether or not we're still in remission, or whatever might be going on. And instantly those fears come back as we approach that testing or scan date. That stays with us for a long, long time. And so I think acceptance is something that happens long into the process, and that we find a way to benefit and grow from the experience. And therefore we accept that I have been a cancer patient. I am a cancer patient. I am living with cancer. And that allows us to continue our lives. But I think it is much more common to acknowledge that this is a new reality and to fight it every step of the way.
It's so powerful, because when you started to talk about your experience, and I see both John and Michele nodding their head, like, again, not going through cancer myself, but then realizing, wow, yeah, the acceptance is at multiple times and multiple levels. My follow-up question to this, and I know we want to get onto the next topic here in a second, but in your research, I know you talked about, the physiological response to diagnosis and to treatments. But was there ever any research, and this is where I wanted to ask about acceptance, and I'd be fascinated about this, because I've seen on the podcast when people accept the cancer and they're no longer fighting the cancer, like not fighting the cancer, but fighting why they got the cancer. And they accept that cancer diagnosis, and now they move forward with a plan. If you've seen in any of your research that there is something of a physiological response to the body, and how they're able to fight cancer versus fighting the fact that they got the cancer, they don't know why they got the cancer, and why this was all happening to them.
Right. Well, and I think you raised a really good point, Dino, which is that when we are in that fight or flight mode, we are awash with adrenaline, and that adrenaline actually doesn't help us in the healing process. And so it can make us run faster, but it makes the heart race faster, and it's actually experienced as stress. And chronic stress weakens the immune system. So there is a chemical thing there that happens when we continue to fight the fact that we have cancer. And there's all sorts of great research that has been done on how mind-body experiences, whether it is singing in the choir, or doing yoga, or Tai Chi, or My favorite was knitting, because your hands are moving and your brain has to be repeating that pattern, knit one, purl one, knit one, purl one, whatever. But all of those mind-body things actually have been shown to sort of turn down the adrenaline response and help us reverse some of that, some of the bad chemicals flooding through our brain, and introduce some more positive chemical flows that do help strengthen the immune system and aid in recovery. And we can talk about that a little bit more when we move on to the topic of exercise. But in general, you're right. If we're continuing to fight the fact that we have cancer instead of fighting the cancer, we're not necessarily helping ourselves.
Well, that's a great segue into the next subject, which is, and thank you for answering that question. It's fantastic. And I just have seen a lot here on the podcast, doing this and having so many survivors on, that it's interesting. I get to draw this certain picture when people tell their stories of how they get to when they get to that point of accepting and not fighting with the cancer anymore emotionally, but taking it head on. So it's just fascinating to me, again, from my point of view, how I've seen journeys and talking about that acceptance and how that affects you emotionally. So let's talk about the role of exercise in aiding physical and emotional recovery from and reducing the reoccurrence from cancer. So Cynthia, if you want to tee that up, and then we'll go to John first and then Michele.
Sure. Well, as a newcomer to the exercise junkie life, I can start by saying that, during my experience with cancer, I forced myself to go for a walk pretty much every day. There were usually 2 days a chemo cycle that I just couldn't leave the couch. But other than that, I would force myself to go for a walk. And not only did it feel nice to be outdoors, even if it was a cold, wintry day, but it definitely got me up and off the couch and moving. And it was only much later that I came to understand that that exercise was helping with the fatigue and the emotions, as well as helping to strengthen the immune system. And so the first thing I became aware of is that our bodies produce red blood cells on demand. And of course, we're producing red blood cells, millions and millions of them are being created every day. But our red blood cells carry the oxygen that give us energy. And a lot of red blood cells get killed off by chemotherapy and also by radiation treatment. I'm less up on the science of immunotherapies because there are so many different ones, but I know for a fact that those two things, of course, kill a lot of red cells. We lose our blood, and therefore our red blood cell count is depleted. So, just like marathoners will go to, high elevation to train because it encourages their bodies to produce more red blood cells, and those red blood cells then give them more energy on the day of the race. What I learned is that we can tell our bodies to produce more red blood cells by demanding more energy from ourselves. And we do that by exercising. And so, for me, the first couple of days after a chemo cycle, didn't want to leave the couch, but then I could force myself to, walk a quarter of a mile, walk a half a mile, walk a mile. And by the end of the 3 weeks until it was time to get whacked again, I was to the point where I had pretty much recovered all of the red blood cells that I had lost. Now, you can't quite get them back unless you're a marathoner before you get your cancer diagnosis. We all start from a different point of health before diagnosis, but that drive to produce more red blood cells really helped me maintain my energy. And it was only, afterwards that I came to understand why. And the same, it turns out, is true for white blood cells that help to to fight infection and stimulate the immune system. That the exercise helps to strengthen the immune system by helping to encourage the development of additional white blood cells and other components of the immune system. What kind of exercise? Any kind of exercise. Clean the house, go for a walk, lift weights, take a swim, do yoga, do Tai Chi, whatever it was. All of those exercises, not only do they flood our brains with endorphins, which are another chemical in our bodies and brains that help us feel good, but it stimulates the immune system. And all sorts of research has been done that shows that exercise strengthens the immune system. And of course, it's the immune system that helps us recover from cancer and helps reduce the likelihood of recurrence and progression. And so exercise is a relatively simple thing. And of course, you have to get your doctor's permission. I'm not an exercise guru that can say this is how much exercise you individual cancer patient should be doing. But the research definitely shows that when your doctor approves it, the more exercise you can do, the better. But it also makes sense to listen to your body. And sometimes, you go for a walk one day and the next day you are wiped out and say, nope, I'm just going to lie here. And recovery includes not just exercise, but also rest. And sometimes our sleep is disturbed by all of the anxiety and all of the chemical changes in our bodies. Exercise can be helpful in stimulating a good night's sleep, but it can also overtire us and mean that because we're not sleeping well, we're too tired to exercise on a regular basis.
So, and I know I think the one thing when we talk about exercise, the role of exercise, I know you gave a bunch of options, but I think we have to take this back a bit, because I think when people think exercise, people are listening to this like, oh my God, and I know we run a lot, so people think like, oh, I got to go out and run a marathon. I think here that the point is just being active, right? It could be, like you said, I think you did mention like getting up and going to your mailbox, or meditating, or even doing yoga for 5 to 10 minutes. It's not this vigorous, you're going to CrossFit or you're going to go run a half marathon this weekend and you're logging 3 miles a day. This is just getting the body up and moving and going. So
it could be as simple as running the vacuum cleaner. That's exercise. That's a 20-pound thing you're moving around.
Yeah. So with that, I want to go to John here first and have him share and talk a little bit about the role of exercise in aiding his physical and emotional recovery from cancer.
So many things were said that are very important, and I can relate to all of them. If you start back to what I think Cynthia was saying, that we all start in a different place. And that's true. And I'm a very lucky guy. I've always been healthy. I've never been overweight. I've always been active, much more active when I was younger. I mean, when we were younger, we went out and played outside. We didn't have video games and things like that to keep us on the couch. I feel for the kids today. But as you progress throughout your life and you remain active, some people get a job and now they're sitting behind a desk. So as soon as they start their working career, they're sitting all the time. And that's not the best thing. And I had never had a desk job. I was always physically working outside. So my starting point when I was diagnosed was I was in relatively good shape. I used to run. I played all kinds of sports. I wasn't good at any of them, but I did it. So when you think about someone who has had the opportunity to sit behind a desk for many, many years, now they're 60 years old and they get diagnosed with cancer and they're overweight and they're starting from a tough spot. And then when you're diagnosed and you look at the numbers, you say 11% survive, 89% do not. Your mind, it's very, very difficult. But You have to be positive, and you have to fight. You have to be willing to fight this thing, because if you don't, I don't think you have a very good chance. And when it comes time for the operation and the chemo and everything, as we all have said, you just want to lay down on it and do nothing. You have to force yourself to get up and walk down the hall and walk back down the hall. And I was doing this in the hospital after the operation. The day after the operation, I grabbed that IV pole and I just went up and down the corridors in there, because they said, you got to walk. All right, I'm going to walk. I want to do what the experts tell me to do, because I believe that it will help me. And like I said, I started from a good spot. I feel for people who it's such a hard thing for them to do, to become physically fit all of a sudden with everything else that's happening to them. And yet you don't really have a choice. You have to fight this thing. So exercise, walking, that is the best thing. And Cynthia was saying vacuuming. I don't care what it is. You've got to move. You can't stay in that chair. And I think that my activity level has dropped significantly since the operation, because I spent almost a year in that position of just, I've got nothing. I got no more left. But I would walk and I would do my exercises, not, lifting weights and stuff, but just movements. And when all of this happened, at the same time, I'm getting older. So is it my energy level is dropping because I'm older, or because I had cancer, or because I spent so much time laying down? I'm not sure, but I have to trudge on and try to get back. I'll never get back to where I was, but I got to maintain. So exercises to me is monumental. Positivity and exercise.
I just want to quickly jump in and say the answer to your question is yes, yes, and yes.
Yeah, I know.
It's a combination. And of course, wherever it is we start off, it can take us, year and a half, 2 years to get to be as well as we're going to be. But as you said, never going to get back to where I was. Time has happened. Deconditioning has happened. Cancer has happened. And therefore, yes, yes, and yes.
I agree.
Love it. Michele, what did you do in terms of exercise and aiding your physical and emotional recovery from and reducing your reoccurrence from cancer? So is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, thanks. And John, I just really could empathize with a lot of the comments that you made. And Cynthia, you mentioned exercise junkie. I am not. I'm not an exercise junkie. Never have been. I do think that there's this weird thing that happens in your brain where you should do it, right? Like, you get in that place that John was describing. And to me, when people say you're in the fight, that's a good example of a fight, because you don't want to get up. You just don't. And if your brain could tell you you're going to feel so much better if you do this, and if your brain could reconcile where you are in that moment of like, I just don't want to get up, but like, it's going to feel so much better if you can just take a walk to the mailbox. And so I found myself in that fight a lot. But like John said, when I had my Whipple procedure, it was made very clear to me that you need to walk if you want to have a successful recovery from this. And it just seems so counterintuitive. You're hooked up to all these things and you feel like your body's been broken. You don't even really know what's going on with your body at that point. But yep, I'm going to get up and walk, because it's so your physical, you almost have to like relearn your physical being, and connect where you are mentally with your physical body. And there's no better way to do that than to find the type of exercise or activity that's going to bring that out for you. And for me, I've had to do, and I still continue to have that fight. I'm on a trial drug right now. Well, it could be a placebo, but we're pretty sure it's the trial drug, and it gives me a lot of fatigue. And so I'm still, I'm past a lot of the main treatments that I've had over the past year, but I'm still in this place of having a lot of fatigue, and it is a constant battle in my head of, I want to just sit down. I'm at the end of my workday. I just want to have dinner and sit down and relax. But what I have to fight through is knowing if I can go take a walk, get outdoors, take a walk, change my point of view, I'm going to feel better. I'm going to actually have more energy if I do that. So I'm in that loop of really having to have that conversation with myself quite often.
Right. Well, and that is that sickness behavior driving the conversation bus. That is the increase in pro-inflammatory cytokines being read by the brain as, nope, we have no energy for anything other than staying safe. And that means we're going to stay right here in this couch. And it's an overwhelming sensation throughout treatment. And whether it is, a maintenance therapy or a placebo therapy, or hopefully you're getting the real therapy, it doesn't matter. Your brain is telling you, go back to bed. You're tired. And it is so hard to break that pattern. One of the things that people have told me is really helpful is having a buddy, making a commitment with somebody else that I will meet you for a walk at 7:00. Sunset's late. You can have dinner, meet a friend for a walk, 3 days a week. Make a commitment, and having somebody else expecting you makes it a little bit easier to make sure that it happens. And the other thing is to find a way to play. I hate working out, but I love to play. Play, work makes a difference. So if you can, I don't know, meet somebody for a bowling date, or play kickball in the grass with the kids or whatever. All of those things are great exercise, and they are more playful than often we feel a walk might be, or running that vacuum cleaner, which is a necessity. I just need to
get somebody to play badminton with me, and I'll be a happy camper.
There you go. Okay.
It is awesome. And Cynthia, you've probably done this once or twice, because this is a great segue into our next subject here, which is supportive communication with a cancer patient, what a patient wants and doesn't want to hear from friends and loved ones. So I love how the previous two, the first one we segued right into exercise, and now we're segueing right into, as you say, find a friend. And, this is a subject, I think when we were talking about this was like the one to me that like I really got excited about, because when I've mentioned this on the podcast, and John and Michele have probably heard this, I think I asked them both on the podcast as well, is like, this is like the number one call that we get here in the offices. A friend, a loved one gets diagnosed. What's the best thing that I could do for them? And again, just like battling cancer, there's no book. There's also no book on how to treat people with cancer, right? Like, how should you treat someone who has cancer? And again, I hope that this podcast allows the opportunity to share, what works and what people should and shouldn't do in that situation. So on that, let's talk about this subject of supportive communication with the cancer patient.
Yeah. And that's so tricky, because, we all are so different, and we all have a different sense of what we want to keep private and what we want to share. What's really going on psychologically is really dependent a lot on the norms that we grew up with, our DNA, our prior emotional experiences. So it's a little hard to know, and make blanket statements about what is going to be the right thing to say. I often tell people who ask that question that usually the best thing is actually to listen and to say, I'm here for you, and let the patient drive the conversation rather than assume that what the patient might want or need. But I think that it's it's often hard for cancer patients to feel like they can burden their friends and caregivers one more time, one more way. We become so helpless. We come home from the hospital and we're in pain. We can't move. We can't get in and out of bed. We need help getting to the bathroom. We need somebody to help us change our dressing, whatever it is. We're so dependent. And if we were the driving force in a household, grocery shopping, making meals, tending to kids, going to the office, earning the money that keeps the insurance in place. And now all of a sudden we can't do that. We're asking other people to pick up the pieces for us. And so we feel like we've already burdened our caregivers so much. And oh, by the way, they're feeling much of the same stress, not the emotional, not the chemically driven emotional stress that we're feeling, but a lot of the same stress around, is she going to survive? How am I going to get on with her? How am I going to keep the household running while she is dealing with her cancer? And on and on and on. And so again, we feel like we can't necessarily burden them. And so, as Michele said, you find another outlet for some of your emotional issues, so that you're not burdening your spouse with your fears. But you do need to be able to be honest with them about what you're feeling. And one of the things that happens frequently in a cancer situation is that the patient holds back a little bit of their emotions, and the spouse or loving caregiver, care partners hold back a little bit of their emotions. And we start to have a gap growing in the communication and the emotional intimacy between friends and care partners. And it's hard to know. It's like, well, when can I share? How much is it safe to share? And some of that is we're being self-protective. We don't want to open ourselves up and then get a bad response. One patient I interviewed, a devastating diagnosis of appendix cancer, and he was telling one of his buddies, and his friend said, "Well, we all got to go sometime," as if it was accepted that he was dying, as opposed to, what can I do to help you get through this? And so we don't necessarily want to expose ourselves and have a bad response, and so we don't share. Or as a care partner, we don't want to assume a degree of emotional response that the patient hasn't already shared with us. And so we don't ask. Or maybe we're not capable of dealing with one more stress, and so we don't ask. And often, we sort of negotiate through the process. And then treatment ends and everybody says, "Oh, great, Cynthia's all fine. I don't have to ask her anymore about, does she need any help?" And a lot of people sort of disappear from the supportive care world when treatment ends, even though for most of us, we are nowhere near ready to jump back into to life as it used to be. So it's a tricky process, and knowing what to say and how to say it and how to be respectful of the patient's needs can be challenging.
So Michele, we're going to go to you first here. In your experience, what did you hear from your friends and loved ones that was supportive?
Yes. And I think people often, they don't, it's kind of like rings of your family, friends, and then kind of colleagues, got different rings of people. And I think depending on where someone is in your life, they might not know what to say at all. They might reach out with a card or flowers, which I always appreciated any of that. Anybody who took an effort to make any supportive gesture, whether it was a text message or, a handwritten card. That's my love language, by the way. I'm a words of affirmation person. And I would tell people, because I did share on my Facebook page, I would share very periodically, not frequently, but like generally after like maybe a milestone in my treatment, I would share something, and then I would say within that post, your messages, your cards, everything, it means so much to me. And like just reaffirming for people, if they're doing something that is meaningful for you, to give that feedback to people, because then I think they'll feel more confident about that and do it more. When you kind of start bringing the rings in, I had, family and friends, they don't know what to do. And some people may have been through situations in the past where they supported another person who was close to them with cancer, and they already have an idea in their mind about what they need to do, what needs to be done for Michele. And I think where people can go wrong is if they don't involve the person who's sick in brainstorming of what do you need? Because I was thinking, my husband and I often thought about, like, when I went through all of my treatment, we didn't have kids in the house. Our kids are grown and flown. And if for some reason we still had kids in the house, I'll tell you what we would have needed for support would have looked a lot different. And I don't know how some families go through it when you have, one of the parents with a busy household on the sidelines like this. You need a lot of support. But what we needed was a little bit different. And so I had a friend of mine who I think she just was a good observer, and she had a good idea of what went on in our household, and then overlay COVID over a lot of this, right? Because we were being very cautious about, not having people around because we didn't want to introduce that risk for me. So she knew, I was having a hard time to find things I liked to eat, but I loved bagels, and you can't get a good bagel in the town I live in, but she makes them. And so she kept me stocked with bagels for weeks on end, and they were wonderful. And then she would, along with the box of bagels, stick a bottle of vodka for my husband, my poor husband, his vitamin D. But, I think as someone who loves a person with cancer, I think you have to involve them with brainstorming for ideas. You have to really understand what's going on in their network. I had people that wanted to come to my treatment sessions with me, but they were only allowing one person, and you bet that was going to be my husband, right? So, I think some people it's hard to meet everyone's expectations when you're the one that is sick, and you shouldn't have to do that. So involve them in what it is that they want for support, and be observant and understanding of what is going on in that lifestyle in that household, because what is needed for support is different for each person.
Yeah, I think that's so such good advice to say, be observant and to listen and to involve the patient. There was one patient who shared her story with me and told me that somebody jumped in and decided that she needed to clean her house for her and clean the bathroom, and it was such a generous offer, but never had the conversation to say, would you like me to clean your house? Would you like me to scrub your bathroom? And as the patient, she felt like, well, there's another element of control that had been taken away from me. I have zero control over my life. And now somebody who is a friend, but not a dear friend, is going to clean my bathroom. That feels far too personal. I don't want that.
Yeah.
So, a conversation about, would it be okay if I brought over dinner tonight? Would you like it if I took the kids with us on Saturday for this adventure? Would it be helpful if I arranged transportation for you for your next couple of appointments? So many ways that conversation can go, but it starts with being observant and knowing the patient and the household, and secondly, with involving the patient in the conversation.
John, we'll go to you next here. Was there things that you heard when you were going through your journey as a cancer patient that you wanted to hear from friends and family, and maybe some examples of that?
Well, a lot has changed in 7 years, and awareness is forefront now. There's all kinds of cancers. But back 7 years ago, we didn't know too much about it. And my friend came over when I called him and told him that I'd been diagnosed, and his sister-in-law had passed away from pancreatic cancer. They understood how bad it was. And when they heard that, hey, John was just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, it's like, well, they had to come over. I don't know if they knew what they were going to say or anything, but their thing was they brought a lot of information about pancreatic cancer with them because they had gained all of that information from their sister-in-law. So when they came over, of course, they know me well, and my family knows me well, and they know that I'm a fighter, and that if anybody can beat this thing, John can beat this thing, and I think everybody felt that. What they say, the words they say, or the words that what did I want them to say? I would like them to say, hey, make this go away somehow. It's never going to happen. So I don't know what I wanted anyone to say, and they don't know what they want to say. So it's kind of a very difficult thing. And then everybody's in a different spot. If you're stage 2 and you're eligible for the Whipple, I'm just talking primarily about pancreatic cancer here, then that's one situation. So there's one person. This person over here is overweight. He's stage 4. His wife wants a divorce. He doesn't have medical insurance. The situations can be so different that, and I don't think anybody, unless you run into somebody, then it's like, oh, what do I say? It's not like you're going to go to some stranger's house or somebody who you don't know very well and go over there and talk to them about pancreatic cancer. I don't think people do that. It's when you nonchalantly run into someone, that's where it's like, oh my God, what do I say? What do I say? And I know in my particular case, my wife, Cindy, she just couldn't talk about it. She couldn't talk about it. One day she went to the bank and somebody had heard, and the teller at the bank said, oh, Cindy, I'm so sorry. And she burst out crying because she'd rather not talk about it because then she doesn't cry. It's very difficult for everybody involved. And I personally don't have an answer as to what to say.
Yeah.
I just I thought of one thing too, as John was talking, but like one thing that helped me is to, in the back of my mind, assume good intent, because some people don't say the right things, and it's not the words that they say, they're really not matching their heart or their intent. And I tried to always assume good intent, unless it was an arch enemy, and then I knew they were trying to. I tried to assume that there was a good intention behind it.
Yes. Well, I think that's absolutely right, Michele. And sometimes there's even good intention behind silence. I didn't hear from my brother throughout my cancer treatment. And that's not because he doesn't love me. And I know that, even though it felt hurtful at the time, it was his inability to get comfortable enough with the idea that I might die, to be able to engage in a conversation with me during my treatment process and during the time when he was so uncertain about the outcome. And so the good intention was there, but the inability to know how to act on it prevented the conversation. And I think that often people don't know what to say. And again, because we don't talk about mental health as a society, and we don't talk about cancer. And so we're certainly not going to talk about the mental health of cancer. And that hesitancy keeps a lot of people from being supportive in ways that we would anticipate that they would be supportive.
I hope that this episode gets people talking about it, though, Cynthia and Michele and John, right? Like, and hopefully, and I was smiling as you said that, Cynthia, about, having these conversations, because I think these are all very difficult conversations to have, right? As everyone has expressed, going through their own personal journeys and how certain people dealt with it, right? Like you all three just gave really accurate examples of that. But I think I think and I hope by us talking about it here, we allow people to open up and to talk about it. And hopefully the person on the other line watching or listening to this, then maybe we'll think about it differently, and be able to do it. And Cynthia, you're right. There's no rule book. I mean, there's a lot of resources, right, on cancer. And all cancers are so different, as John had mentioned. There's various, just within pancreatic cancer, right? Like everyone's different in how they're diagnosed, how their circumstance, their health, their financial status. We see that every day here with patients that reach out to us, and so there's not one size fits all. And so everyone deals with it differently. They come with it a different set of circumstances. They come from different paths of life, and how they deal with that is different. But I guess I hope that we share some ideas here that are thought provoking, that start those conversations, because these are hard conversations, right? But it's I guess I look back at I try to use like sports a lot of times, and I know we were talking about the role of exercise just before. And I think the biggest step is that first step, whatever that first step may be. If it's getting off the couch to vacuum, if that's the role of exercise, or getting off the couch to walk down the driveway to get the mail, or in this situation, having that first conversation with that loved one that, hey, this is where I'm coming from. This is my intent behind why I'm being quiet, or why I want to clean that bathroom is because I don't know how to deal with this, right? Like, I don't know how to deal with the loss of losing a loved one or seeing a loved one struggle through this. And this is how I'm dealing with it. So I hope that this has kind of gets that conversation going, or gets those ideas going, and also allows people the opportunity to think in that mindset. Our last piece here is self-advocacy. And what do I want to do here is I'd love, and I know, Cynthia, that we can go down all these rabbit holes. I always say rabbit holes, but these are very thought-provoking topics. But with self-advocacy, I know we talk a lot about it. You've done a lot of talk on this. I'd love to hand it over to you, but then I'd love to go back to Michele and John, and John first, and then Michele. But just talk about maybe their best practice that they had, or maybe still do this in self-advocacy with their doctor or with their medical team, to just share like maybe something that they've kind of seen that's worked really well with them, to share with our audience. So with that, Cynthia, it's back to you for self-advocacy.
Sure. And that's such an important topic, Dino, because as I say to the patients that I mentor, nobody knows what it's like inside your body other than you. You're the only one who knows what you're feeling, both physically and emotionally, how the treatment is affecting you. And, your doctor may be the expert in your particular type of cancer and this particular treatment, but you are the only expert in you. And so it has to be that every time you're with your doctor, it is a dialogue between experts. It is a conversation that happens between two people with mutual respect for each other because of their different expertise, and because of the high level of expertise that they both bring to that conversation. But that's a really big ask for a lot of people. Many of us grew up with the sense that, we do whatever it is the doctor tells us to do, that the doctor is the only expert, and that we should just be quiet and listen. But more and more, we are learning that medicine happens at its best when, in fact, the doctor is fully informed about what you're experiencing. And even something as simple as pain. which, is never really that simple. But it turns out that when pain is better managed, recovery happens better. And it also turns out that our emotions really influence how we recover. Our emotions influence how well we adhere to treatment and how well we are able to tolerate treatment. Our sensation of pain is greater when we are depressed or stressed than when we are calm. So we can't really separate the emotional from the physical. And so we need to engage with our care professionals in a way that relies on our expertise as to how it feels inside, both physically and emotionally, so that we can have that conversation.
I love it. Let's go to John on your best practice with self-advocacy, John, during your whole journey. And this could be something that you're still doing now, something that you do with your doctor and your medical team, and being that supportive and that strong self-advocate.
I think the main thing is you have to be honest, and you have to be honest with your doctor, and you have to open up and explain how you feel. When you're sitting there with the doctor and you're asking him all these questions, he can't give you the answers that you want. But if you have a tougher diagnosis than I did, or a worse stage, there are things now. There are clinical trials. There are many more things than there were 7 years ago that you can advocate for. And part of the advocation for yourself is your own work, fight, research to find out what is available. And I would do anything, whatever it would take. And if it was some kind of oddball therapy or whatever, if that's my choice, if that's my only choice, then I'm going for it. But I have to trust the experts. But then again, you have to ask the experts. It's not just one. So you have to advocate for yourself by researching and finding out what's available. It's part of the fight.
Powerful. Michele, anything that you have done in working with your medical team and your doctor to be that self-advocate that you could share?
Yeah, and I would, at the risk of repeating some of the things that John said, because it's very similar, and I find that to be very interesting about us, John. But I definitely felt from the beginning, once I got through the turmoil of understanding the diagnosis, I got pretty quickly to the point of what's my job here, what's my role, and one of the pieces that was important to me in my job was to really engage as much as I could to learn, find what resources were available to me and learn. And then, for example, that's how the clinical trial that I'm in now, I found it myself. I brought it to my oncologist. And so it wasn't like, I guess I never went to an appointment thinking, oh, I just can't wait to show up and find out what's provided to me. I knew certain things would be provided to me, but I felt like it had to be that dialogue of, what could I learn about what's going on with pancreatic cancer? I mean, this is the fight of your life when you have this type of cancer. It's a very, very dismal prognosis for most people. And so what higher purpose do I have right now in my life than I need to learn everything I can about it so that I can ask the right questions and have that dialogue with my doctors. And honestly, I got to the end of my treatment. I was no evidence of disease in December of 2021. And I had found this trial that I'm in now. And by all rights, someone would say, why are you going into a trial now? You're healthy. You've completed treatment. And the point of this trial is for to determine if this trial drug can prevent recurrence of pancreatic cancer, which has a very high recurrence rate, and especially in the first 2 years. I think it's 60 or 70%. And so my advocacy went beyond finishing the treatment to say there's something more I can do, and it's taking a lot of time and financial resources to engage in this, but I feel really good about it because it feels like something I can do that may benefit me, but by all means will benefit the learning that we have about how to prevent recurrence for this disease. But to me, that's how I think an example of how I've approached advocacy for myself, of like really working hard to understand what's going on out there in the medical community around research and what's evolving in terms of the treatment for pancreatic cancer, particularly for some of the genetic risk.
I think you raised such a great point, Michele, about the need to do your own research. We're not all natural researchers, and some of us have a different level of need for control than others. I was a high control, high research patient myself, but others don't want to know and don't want to take on that degree of expertise. But it's interesting because even if you don't want to know, there's probably somebody in your care team who does and can play that role. And I know a number of patients who said, you know what, I can't read the medical literature, but this person can. And I'm assigning them the task of understanding everything about my disease and helping me in the decision-making process. And that's a really interesting way of advocating for yourself. And we don't necessarily think about self-advocacy with our care teams, but we all have a group of people around us who have always played different roles in our lives. There was one patient who was in her 70s when she got a devastating diagnosis, and her daughter happened to have worked at a pharmaceutical company. And she said to her daughter, "You do it. You figure out what I should and shouldn't be doing. You show up for every single one of my appointments and talk with the doctor because you're going to be the expert. I can't be the expert in this, but you can be." And that was her way of advocating for herself. She couldn't have the dialogue that, we've talked about needing to have with your doctor, but she knew her daughter could. And so she just enlisted her daughter's help. Most of us have somebody around us, even if we're not the ones who can do that research, that would be happy to do that if we engage them in the project.
So powerful, this last subject of self-advocacy is such an important one, and I'm glad we saved it for the end. And I just want to say this. I hate to sound like a broken record, but I do hope for the people listening and watching on the other side that hopefully they've gained some knowledge that they didn't have going into this. And this is what this podcast is about, is sharing stories and sharing these ideas and how people can get through not just the pancreatic cancer journey, but here the cancer journey as a whole, because cancer's cancer, right? And I know from a biological standpoint and from a treatment standpoint, yes, every cancer is different in how they treat the cancer itself. Breast cancer is not like pancreatic cancer in terms of the treatments, but there's some high level things here that I hope this episode has helped people out there in the world today to start these conversations and to think a little bit differently. And as we said, there's really no playbook on how to deal with these things. But I think if you grab some of these resources, here in the pancreatic cancer space, I know, John, you've mentioned, PanCan has some great resources. There's other groups, we provide financial aid. There's other groups that provide certain other assistance in some local geographic areas. So there's a lot of groups out there. I think the challenging piece, there's a lot of challenging pieces, but getting a cancer diagnosis, we kind of get into a tizzy, right? There's that fog of, oh my God. And then you're kind of thrust into the medical system. As we said, the medical system doesn't always, there's a lot of cracks in the medical system, right? From all aspects, emotionally, financially. And so the hope here with this podcast is that we've provided some of these tools and resources so that people have the ability then when they go through this journey that they have kind of a playbook. So with that, I want to thank you guys for once again being guests on the Project Purple podcast. We always share where to connect. And I think the best place for where people can connect is to listen to these previous episodes. So wherever you listen to podcasts, you can search for John's episode, you can search for Michelle's episode, and you can search for Cynthia's episode. And also give Cynthia a plug here because you have your book. It's available on, is it on Audible, Cynthia? I have hard copies.
It's not on Audible, but it is available on Amazon and wherever books are sold. The Big Ordeal, Understanding and Managing the Psychological Turmoil of Cancer. Thank you, John.
I love it. I love it. I love it.
And there's a lot of great information also on my website. If you don't feel like buying a book, feel free to go to thebigordeal.com. A lot of terrific information that was used in the book or is related to the content of the book, and a lot of stories. And every time you listen to or read somebody else's story, it gives you a little bit of an idea that might help you in coping with your own cancer diagnosis. So I highly recommend that you just take a look.
Awesome. Cynthia, thank you for once again for all you do for the cancer community. John and Michele, thank you for your inspiring stories and once again for being a guest on the Project Purple podcast.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure being here.
That's a wrap of another episode of the Project Purple podcast. If you like what you hear today, feel free to share this episode and follow us wherever you listen to podcasts. And until next time, please be safe. Thanks for listening.